So let's first of all talk about what a millennial is.
Okay. A millennial is the most recent term for people who were born, let's say broadly, people who were born during the 80s, 1980s and 1990s. I think that's probably a good term. And the reason I say that is there's a lot of battles about these things, and there were earlier terms like Gen Y and stuff that are now kind of starting to fall out of use that they use for these people. The boundary, I think most people who talk about millennials are talking about are people in their early 20s, at the most their mid-20s. People up around 30 are actually a little bit different.
These are the traditional Gen Xers.
Yeah, you'd say the last couple of years of what people define as Gen X.
A much darker group.
Much darker. Another aspect of them, if you go to the ones who are even older, mid to late 30s, which would be the beginning of Generation X, according to this, they tend to be they have very low expectations. And then oddly enough, the ones right around 30, who basically were, let's say, late teens or college in the late 90s, when we had that sort of cultural boom just, up to 2000.
The Clinton years.
Yeah, the Clinton years, they tend to show, their expectations tend to be very high, and sometimes they're unrealistic. And what you're seeing is with the millennials that are coming along, now that we're moving away from that, the new group coming in, they do feel a sense of entitlement, the way that a child feels there are certain things they automatically should be getting because they're a kid. They have that, so they have entitlement, and this is one of the things they say is negative. On the other hand, they don't come in with what I would call the cult of unearned riches.
They wrote the book Generations.
Generations, A History of America's Future.
And then you collaborated with them on this one...
Millennials and Pop Culture.
Millennials and Pop Culture.
Yes. And I also collaborated with them on developing, because they had some other people writing, and we work in a discussion group. So their model, they say that the millennials start in the 80s when a long decline in fertility from the early 60s, which has gone all through the 60s and 70s, reverses itself.
Right.
And when it reverses itself, it reverses in the early to mid 1980s, and we get a second baby boom, which is why they sometimes call them echo boomers. Now the actual reality is there's so many of them, they're almost the size, depending, they're about the same size as the boomer generation.
Right.
The most characteristic feature of the millennials is that they were a generation that was wanted by their parents. Now obviously, throughout history, people have always wanted their kids, so I'm not saying there wasn't, but if you look at the society-wide attitude to children, which is the environment that I would, have children and raise them. During the 50s, it was very positive that you have a lot of kids. During the 60s and 70s, kids were out. And so when people had kids, in a certain sense, they kind of were bucking a trend. And also, the beliefs, or what was being propagated in pop culture about how to work, what kids needed as they grew up, changed very dramatically from saying we have to kind of take care of them to you leave them alone and they grow up by themselves. In the 80s, it flipped back to this idea we have to take care of kids, we have to protect them, and there was also a perception that the world had become much more dangerous than compared to the 50s when the baby boomers, who were the parental generation, grew up. So the boomers remember a fairly safe time they grew up in. Now they're having their kids. They're having more kids than people had for maybe 15, 20 years or so, and they feel it's much more dangerous. So the way they react is by being very protective to their kids, sheltering them to some extent from the harsher realities of life, at the same time wanting to boost their self-esteem and confidence, telling them they're special. And because of some of the attitudes the boomers carried over from the 60s and 70s, with like political things, they also felt that the kids, there shouldn't be this harsh competition. The way to say it is that everyone's a winner when you look at this group. And so what the millennials are like then, because of that, is that compared to the previous group, and this is sometimes what people have trouble understanding, which is that they're very close to their parents. They like their parents. Whereas if you go back and you look at the previous couple of generations, you'd find your parents are okay. You go back further, there's the full-blown generation gap. And this group isn't like that. They like their parents. Their parents are playing a role in their lives even as they become young adults. The prediction is even when they get in their 30s, the parents, if they're around, they're going to be there.
This is one example of this is the so-called helicopter parents.
Helicopter parents, yes.
Who hover over their children in college and even into the workforce.
Yes.
And so that's one particular aspect. It's a big headache for college administrators.
Yeah.
They get a lot of parental involvement that they didn't used to have to deal with.
In fact, I've done some of the Millennials talks. I've talked at educational institutions specifically on that, and also to their admissions departments, because the admissions groups usually are not used to the idea of a kid coming in, and then when they want to discuss something, suddenly they hit the phone and say, "Talk," which has become much more common than it used to be.
Right.
And then the parents wanting dorms so they can stay a few weeks. The first one is most obvious. You're going to have millennials, very sophisticated with the newest technology, and there'll be a little bit of a technology clash because if we think about technology, older generations use technology different than this generation does. This generation communicates a lot more. They tend to use the media not to send essential communications, but just to make sure they're always in touch all the time with each other.
This is the Twitter generation.
The Twitter generation, and it's like the way Strauss and Howe describe them is that they first call them collegial, which really doesn't get it across, but then they like to be part of a group.
Okay.
And they like forming groups and feeling they're in the group, and if they're out of the group, it's a much more serious problem for them. With managing is going to be that these guys, when they grew up, millennials, would be in a race, and they would come in last, and someone would say, "You're the last winner." We should all be moving up. We all are highly valued. They're not going to be as much about one-upsmanship over each other. And then the fact that they're very close to their parents, and that bond so close, is that a lot of times they're going to imagine their relationship to their boss as paternalistic. And because they communicate all the time, they're going to assume that someone to them all the time. So they're going to interpret it as disapproval, whereas an older generation would assume, well, that must mean nothing's broke.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting notion. So this is a group that wants to be part of a group. People that want to be part of a group want to be communicating all the time and are used to having a very different interaction with the hierarchy.
And these guys, one thing about millennials is that when they were growing up with their parents felt they had to reinvent parenting. And so they felt that being a distant authority figure was wrong, that they had to be their kid's friend. And the end result of that was that the way that millennials interacted with their parents was less, like the way you would with the traditional authority figure. It was more about someone you can negotiate with. And other factors that contributed to that was because they were being more sheltered than the previous people, let's say kids in the 70s. A lot of them never had a job during high school. And a lot of them just basically never really saw the reality of this. And they didn't get allowances either, which is really fascinating, because I remember growing up and having a little allowance. It was discretionary. Many of them grew up with no discretionary income that they could spend. Everything they got involved a negotiation with a parent. And so they're used to the notion that who's ever in charge, if there's an issue, I need to negotiate, not be told. If I'm told what to do, something's very, very wrong. Or if they aren't talking to me at all, there's something really wrong. And that if someone reacts negatively, if I'm trying to negotiate, they're going to assume that the person on the other end understands that this is some sort of weird, negotiation, not that this is someone challenging their authority, which is the way an older generation might interpret it. Actually, there's several. We have a tendency to assume when a new generation comes along, the stories we tend to hear about them are negative. As an example, 60 Minutes ran something a while back on millennials, and they highlighted some of the issues that might occur in the workforce, but they were all negative. And that's really unfair, because there are some real positives with this generation. One of them is they're used to hard work. They were in school during the late 80s and 90s when standards-based testing came in, and it replaced kind of this sort of free-form learning environment that people had experimented with in the 70s.
Grades mattered again.
Grades mattered. There were a lot of tests. Homework tripled in terms of the number of hours people were spending on homework. Between, let's say, the late 70s and early 90s, the number of hours went from about 1 to 3 hours per night. And the end result is they're used to the idea that they're going to have to work really hard, and that it's going to be sort of a structured work environment, which means they're going to be getting things they have to do, and they're discrete and accomplish them, and they're going to be very willing to work in those situations. Another aspect of it is that if millennials do form a relationship with the boss that works, they're going to tend to work very effectively. You know, if the boss can figure out how to handle them.
Because they're used to working, they're used to communicating in groups. There's some really worthwhile things there for a business setting.
Right. And then thirdly, this group, because of their upbringing, responds to praise very highly. So if what you can give your employee, let's say you can't double their salary or whatever, but if you can just basically say it's a great job, they're going to react very positively to hearing that they're doing good work. In fact, if you never talk to them, that's when there's more of a problem. But if you're talking to them and you notice they're making progress, they're doing good things, and there's a constant little communication flying there, they're going to really respond positively. More so than, let's say, the average person would in an older generation, who may be a little bit more, I don't want to say independent, but I'll say they're a little bit more, assume more that I have to just do everything on my own. Or this group, these guys assume we're going to work in a group, we're going to get this all done together, we're all going to jump the hurdle, we're going to figure out what to do, and we're going to work back and forth until we get it right.